It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pires coming to you from Baltimore. Large protests took place in various cities in Brazil last Sunday, with the largest formation in Sao Paulo, where media outlets estimated that over 100,000 people took to the streets against the new conservative government of President Michel Temer. Last week, Brazil's Senate had voted to remove President Dilma Rousseff from office in what her supporters have called a legislative coup. Sunday's protesters were mainly calling for the ouster of President Temer and demanded new elections. Let's have a look at what one of the protesters had to say.
Para mostrar o sentimento verdadeiro do povo e para que o presidente Temer saiba o que está pensando o povo brasileiro diante do golpe que foi realizado contra a presidenta Dilma, que não cometeu crime de responsabilidade, muito menos qualquer ato ilícito. É uma pessoa séria que sempre agiu para o bem.
Once these protests in Sao Paulo officially ended, police unexpectedly clamped down on the remaining protesters and attacked them with tear gas and rubber bullets. Police claimed it was to prevent looting, but reporters from BBC and Spain's newspaper El País say they saw no evidence of looting. While the clashes took place in the streets of Sao Paulo, President Temer, who was in China for the G20 summit, told media, and I quote, "These are small groups. I don't have it numerically, but there are 40, 50, maybe 100 people," he said. Joining us now from Sao Paulo, Brazil, is Alex Main. Alex is the Senior Associate for International Policy at the Center for Economic Policy and Research, where he focuses on U.S. foreign policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. Alex, good to have you with us.
Great to be back, Sharmini.
So, Alex, you are in Sao Paulo at the moment. How large were these protests, and what are the newspapers saying about them?
Well, I wasn't there, but certainly there are many, many images of the protests, and you can see that they really stretch from one end to the other of the enormous Paulista Avenue, which is sort of the main boulevard that crosses downtown Sao Paulo here. And, you know, as you were saying, as the protests came to an end, there were scenes of total mayhem as a great deal of repression took place. There was lots of tear gas. There have been people hurt. And it's really given us a taste of things to come, I think. But what was interesting is that you hadn't seen very big protests in Brazil for a while. You saw a number of small protests during the Olympic Games, but it really seems that with this final decision that the Brazilian Senate made, in which they have permanently suspended the elected President Dilma Rousseff from office, it suddenly, woke people up to the terrible reality of a government, an unelected government that's taking the country in a very, very right-wing direction. So there's definitely a sort of a changed ambiance now in Sao Paulo, and I have walked around the streets a bit, and one thing you do see are lots of graffiti saying "Fora Temer," get out Temer, and also saying, Temer is a golpista, Temer is a coup perpetrator.
And so what is the general mood there when you talk to people about what happened to Dilma Rousseff and what's to come in the near future?
Well, the mood is, I think, one of growing resistance, really, and that's what we saw with these protests. And, people are trying to organize. It's not easy because, the party that ruled for the last 12 years, the Partido de Trabajadores, the Workers' Party of Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff, is not very greatly admired and broadly admired in Brazilian society today. And, with good reason. They've also been implicated in many corruption scandals, though, as the mainstream media in the U.S. Doesn't always point out, of course, Dilma Rousseff was not implicated in these corruption scandals, and in fact, one of the few clean senior political figures. And she was taken down, of course, by some of the most corrupt members of the political class here. So at any rate, I think there's a lot of discontent with political parties in general here. And I think, people are focused now on sort of renewing the grassroots struggles and social movements, including the MST, the landless workers movement, the movement of those without roofs, the sem techos, and others are very energized, working together in a unified manner. And I think this does give a certain amount of hope, if not for the short term, at least in the medium or long term in Brazil.
Right. And as I mentioned in the introduction, Alex, President Temer made light of the protests, claiming that it was only a handful of people. Obviously, that was not the case. There are other indications that Temer is trying to minimize the opposition against him by soft pedaling the kind of protest that's going on. Even when he was at the Olympics at the opening ceremonies, there was a lot of boos against him. What is the likelihood that he will step aside and hold these elections as the protesters are demanding?
Well, it's entirely unlikely. And I think, this was a right-wing power grab. They weren't able to win. The right wasn't able to win through elections. In the last elections, they lost, though by a small margin. And they're not prepared to now release their grip on power after having spent 12 years trying to get back in control. So I think that's entirely unlikely. It's more than certain that he will be in place until the end of 2018. The only manner that he might be dislodged might be an internal coup within his party and together with one of the other opposition parties. His party is the PMDB, and the PSDB could work together to unseat him, and then they would carry out, if they unseated him through an impeachment process, as was done with Dilma Rousseff. If this takes place in the last 2 years of the presidential term, there are then indirect elections through the Congress. And as we know, the Congress is close to 60% corrupt and controlled by the opposition, and they most certainly would put in another one of their leaders, and it could well be José Serra, the current foreign minister.
Alex, in a recent Wall Street Journal article, President Temer indicated that he wasn't going to push through undoing some of the PT programs, like the welfare program, the Bolsa Familia, the housing program, and its community doctors programs, and all these good things that PT put into place, because he fears that there is mounting opposition against him, like the demonstrations we just saw. Are people buying that? And do they realize how serious undoing these programs would mean to their livelihood?
Well, no, I think we have to see what's going to happen at this place at this moment. I mean, the next steps aren't very clear. We know that legislation has been introduced to deregulate the labor market more, to carry out some broad reforms, structural reforms of the economy, and certainly to do away or to diminish a lot of the social programs. We have to see now whether the Congress and the president move forward on this agenda. So that's not entirely clear. And of course, there's only so much that an unelected government can do, and particularly when you have protests that are growing in the country.
Alex, interesting statements were issued by Human Rights Watch, the person responsible for Latin America, and also the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. What are they saying about what took place in Brazil last week?
Well, what's interesting, I think, about these statements is, that they're diverging. For one, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, where a petition has just been filed by members of the unthroned President Dilma Rousseff, members of her party, to try to get a case opened to look into what they say obviously was a coup by the Inter-American Commission, and after that, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. That statement that was released by the Inter-American Commission expresses concern about irregularities, about the arbitrary nature of the impeachment process, and, about just the general manner in which the impeachment process has taken place. Meanwhile, you have a former member of that commission, Jose Miguel Vivanco, who's at Human Rights Watch, in charge of the Americas program there, who was in Brazil.
You're talking about Jose Miguel Vivanco.
That's right, Jose Miguel Vivanco. He was in Brazil really just as, Dilma Rousseff was being removed from power by the Brazilian Senate. And he, held a press conference, and he told the media, and it was picked up by all of the right-wing media in Brazil, that Human Rights Watch doesn't consider this to be a coup, nor will they ever consider it to be a coup. They said the Brazilians should be proud of the example that they've set for the world. Largely praised the whole impeachment process, and said it really showed, that Brazil's institutions and democracy are strong, a bit reflecting the same line that the State Department has taken ever since the impeachment process against Dilma Rousseff was launched. And in contrast with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, in contrast with many human rights groups, and there have been many statements over the last few weeks, including one that was signed by a broad range of human rights groups, women's groups, workers' organizations, including the AFL-CIO and others, that really denounced the whole process. And pointed out how flawed it was, where, of course, the main charge against Dilma of violations of the fiscal laws in Brazil were thrown out by Brazil's public prosecutor. Therefore, there was absolutely no substance to the impeachment, when it was finalized just a week ago. There are very obvious flaws. Vivanco should be aware of this. But, we really saw his agenda as well in these same statements that he made to the Brazilian press, where he praised the de facto foreign minister, José Serra, who has come out very strongly against the current government of Venezuela, has made, a lot of statements against Venezuela, and is trying to prevent Venezuela from exercising the presidency of Mercosur, the bloc of countries in the south of South America, which Venezuela is now a member of. So he's been on the offensive, and Vivanco came out very supportive of Serra. And so, we see that his agenda is a very narrow one in the region, and it's to go after Venezuela. And any government willing to do so, no matter how weak its democratic credentials may be, as is the case in Brazil, it doesn't matter so long as they are focused on trying to undermine the government in Venezuela. So that's his real agenda. And of course, he's given a big boost to the right wing in Brazil through these statements. And not just the right wing in Brazil, but also in the US. You have people like Andres Oppenheimer of the Miami Herald, who have picked up Vivanco's quotes. You really saw it all over the Brazilian press. Look, Human Rights Watch is saying that everything is perfectly democratic in Brazil, therefore it has to be true. He's saying it's not a coup, therefore it has to be therefore that has to be true. So he is really giving a lot of legitimacy to this new government in Brazil.
Very strange behavior on the part of Human Rights Watch, who otherwise, in some very good cases, give moral guidance to these kinds of issues, seem to be failing the Brazilian people, as it did, I must remind you, prior to the coup against President Chavez in Venezuela. Those of us who are familiar with how this particular director Vivanco behaved prior to the coup that took place against President Chavez and thereafter with similar statements. We could continue this conversation, Alex, but time is limited in terms of how much people will spend watching these things online. So I thank you so much for joining us, and hope to continue this conversation as things unfold in Brazil.
Thanks, Shamini.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.